You're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm your host, Talia Baroncelli. This is part 2 of my discussion with Dr. Saeed Rahnema. Feel free to watch part 1 first if you haven't done so already. And also help us out if you can by going to our website, theanalysis.news. You can hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. And most importantly, get onto our mailing list. That way you never miss new content. See you in a bit with Dr. Saeed Rahnema. I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Saeed Rahnema. He is a retired political science professor, as well as professor of public policy at York University in Toronto, Canada. He was the director of the York School of Public Policy and Administration and a director of the nonprofit Middle East Economic Association. He was born and raised in Iran and was a member of the Industrial Management Institute there. During the Iranian Revolution of 1979, he was a leading activist in the Left and Workers' Council movement, as well as being a founder and member of the executive of the Union of the Workers and Employee Councils of one of the largest industrial conglomerates in Iran, known as IDRO. His recent publications include The Transition from Capitalism, as well as Neoliberal Imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism. So it's really great to have you here, Dr. Rahnema. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you. That's great.
There's one other thing that we should maybe address before we get to the issue of democracy, and that was something that you also mentioned in the article that Gramsci said, that the problem will lie within the proletarian itself, and you already addressed this, that there is this required socialization, and sometimes the working class might not have, or you question whether they have the ability to actually raise certain demands or certain radical demands that are necessary to enable or initiate a transition away from capitalism and towards taking political power and towards having workers' control. So you're speaking about this hegemonic aspect of, the mentality of the working class, the adoption of certain bourgeois values. Would you say that's still relevant in light of what you just spoke about, how the working class has changed over time? How do you evaluate what Antonio Gramsci was talking about back then following the April strike, and how would you apply it now?
Well, definitely, if workers are the main protagonists and agents of such a major transformation, obviously they should be prepared for it ideologically, socially, politically, culturally, and organizationally. Unfortunately, we don't have this situation. There is. First of all, of course, we have not limited this discussion to any particular part of the world, and that's where we have many areas of the world that even do not have unions. My original country, Iran, after over 150 years of a struggle for democracy and several major revolutions, the workers do not have a union. They've got Islamic associations, which is a different situation. But even in those cases that we have unions, we have great unions in Europe, in North America. But at the same time, those unions are also very bureaucratized. They need to be reformed. They need to be radicalized. The reason why working class is weak is partly because of the failure of the left. The left in the West, which is a very different story, has not been able to take advantage of all the problems that working class and other people are faced in capitalist society, particularly in the present post-Keynesian neoliberal aspect. So I think that's why it's very significant that there should be changes so that the working class would be prepared and ready. And why participation is important? Because participation is also a learning process. when workers sit in management, they also learn how to be managers of their own companies at the later stage. And there are so many other things, the working class, apart from its segmentation, ideologically is also very differentiated. We should not forget that this is so tragic to see in many of the advanced capitalist societies. Many of the significant number of working class vote for the right and far right parties. So in the United States, Trump gets lots of support from the working class. All of these shows that there are serious problems, and there should be lots of efforts in order to be able to organize. Because it's not enough to say that workers should go and control the production. How they should do it, and we cannot do it without change of the political system. This is my if I want to reduce all of my discussion, is that you cannot have workers' control at the production level without having a progressive, radical state in power.
Well, what is required for this radical progressive state, or what are the components of it? Because, again, you mentioned democracy before.
Okay, this is for me, this is a totally different topic. I have this book.
Well, we don't have to discuss necessarily the exact transition, but I just mean, what is your conception of democracy? Because this word itself, there are different meanings of democracy. Some people would say that, some scholars would say that, to have democracy, you actually need a market. You need market capitalism in order for it to work. Others would say that that's not a reflection of reality. Others would say that, there's popular democracy, there's liberal democracy, and some would say these are just different terms to ignore the fact that there still are large inequalities within democratic systems, and they're not really democratic. So I guess my main question is what really do you mean by that word democracy?
There are two aspects. First of all, I said that the movement the movement onward should be democratic. This is one, and then I'll explain what type of democracy I have in mind. Why it should be democratic. The present society is not the two-class society that was expected, a minority bourgeois and a majority working class. In today's societies, we have the new middle class, we have traditional middle class, or the traditional petty bourgeoisie, and we have the, I don't have a term for it, underclass, or any term that you use for totally marginalized people. So we have got, in a sense, 5 classes, not 2 classes. At the same time, today we have the so-called identitarian groups. We have feminists, we have environmentalists, we have peace activists, youth, and others fighting for right causes. So the argument is that working class is not the sole agent of change anymore. Or I think it was never, but now it's very obvious. That's why, in order to have it, we cannot have the idea of just workers and the dictatorship of proletariat and others. So we need to have a combination of all these classes and identitarian groups to be able to gradually weaken capital and capitalist class, and then move step by step forward. This is the democratic nature as opposed to a dictatorial and revolutionary type that at least I was a believer during the revolution. but now I reject. As for what type of democracy, well, of course, democracy has different meanings, and liberal democracy has got its own problems. In we know that what are the problems with, for example, democratic system in U.S., in Canada, everywhere, in Germany, in everywhere. But the idea is that we should move toward the type of parliamentary democracy that you have representation of the vast number of people in order to establish a progressive government, and that progressive government comes up with progressive policies. Part of it is free education for all, reduction of class differences and others, and but it's not the end. This democracy is a means to be able to reach the final goal of transition from capitalism, which has a completely different system. But still, it is democratic, I mean, even in the post-capitalist society also, we need the state. I have also my different views from the critique of the Gotha program. I think even in the so-called first phase of socialism, we need to have a state and we need to have representation.
And just lastly, how would you say your experience in Iran, being involved in councils there and also living there throughout the revolution of 1979 going into 1980, how has that experience informed your view? I mean, we started off with this question at the very beginning, but perhaps you can add a bit more of your own personal experience into this discussion.
Okay. May I just before answering that, I forgot to discuss a bit about my notion of radical industrial democracy. If we have time,
go ahead.
that I would do. Yeah.
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah. See, I see that for talking of democracy at two levels. We at the political level, which is the political democracy, and at the production and also social, institutions, that we have industrial democracy. Industrial democracy, I discuss it in a way that I show it in a tri-dimensional matrix, that we have degrees of participation. The lowest would be information sharing, then consultation, then co-management, and then finally self-management, which is workers' control. And then we have the organizational levels, from shop floor to the level of factory, to the level of company, and then depending on how large is the company. And then in different areas of from human resources, production, sales, and management. So my argument is that the stronger the working class and trade unions, the higher would be the degree of participation. If workers are weak, even we cannot have information sharing, as many cases in many different parts of the world, But if they are stronger, they gradually move toward higher levels of that eventually is co-management. The co-management is the radical participation of workers in this process. I think this is very significant that we deal with this, And then how it's operational, I argue that first of all, we need to have democratized union. I do believe in unions. We need to have unions. I don't agree with councilists that we don't need unions. These unions should be democratized, And each of them should have a participative arm, which could be a participative council. This council is different from the managerial council. And since most of the large factories now operate in a downstream, they have a huge upstream and downstream companies, then we have different stakeholders. We have representatives of each of the councils from the whole cluster create the stakeholder councils, and they participate in the work. And the stronger they are, the more important role they can play. This is very briefly, of course, very quickly. This is my notion of industrial policy.
And you're speaking about the importance of unions, which didn't exist when you were in Iran. So,
no.
How would you say that affected the situation there, not having unions?
Very much. You know, if I have time, just very briefly, I mentioned that the case of Iran is hugely significant. And unfortunately, in almost none of the workers by non-Iranian theorists on councils, there has been any mention of it. And ironically, this to my knowledge, this was the widest and the most expansive range of council movement in any of the revolution. Imagine all the industries of Iran, all ministries of Iran, all government agencies, private sector, they had their council. Some of them before the revolution, these were strike committees that turned into councils, and many of them after the revolution. Even in terms of socialization, government also had to socialize, had to nationalize almost all the major industries. 990 industries were nationalized. They were among the nationalized companies. So we had all of these things. In no other revolution you have this. But unfortunately, because of internal problems, because of theoretical confusions, most of us were equating this with the Soviets, which was a wrong notion. I mean, we should have compared them to the workers' committees, the factory committees in Russia, and there were internal divisions, and then there were no union, and no experience of union to support it, because neither under the Shah we had real unions, nor later. So this severely weakened. And then, of course, the most significant aspect that led to its demise was the state. Although the first national government, the Islamist nationalists, liberals, when they came into power, they tolerated councils because they were not powerful enough themselves. But they did not like the councils. They did not support the councils. Most of the factories needed heavy subsidies. They were based on heavy subsidies that they could not operate without the help of government. And government was not ready to do so. And then after the hostage crisis of the American embassy, the hardcore Islamists came into power, and they expelled us all. Some were jailed, some were executed. So that was the end of the council. It's a very tragic end.
Well, perhaps this nationalization that you talk about, which was such a large part of the Iranian Revolution and wasn't really a large part of previous revolutions in the West, was due to what a lot of the revolution stood for, and that was to kind of regain control of the country's resources. And I mean, Mossadegh, who was democratically elected and who was then overthrown by a coup that was led by British intelligence and as well as U.S. intelligence, the CIA, etc. Mossadegh was largely arguing for reclaiming the country's resources from the Anglo oil company. So I think maybe the nationalization that took place during the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was probably a response to I guess, the modernization of the Shah and the Shah's outlook towards the West and wanting to be friendly with the West. And you could say that maybe it was reactionary, but I'm sure some of that was this stance against the West to ensure that they were reclaiming and protecting their own resources, hence nationalizing them.
Yeah, no doubt there is this background, that we have during the Mossadegh era, which unfortunately was toppled by CIA and MI6. But in addition to that, one of the reasons that most of these industries had to be nationalized, because during the revolution, some of the private sector owners, either they fled or they were deposed by their councils, and in also the government-owned industries, many of the managers were expelled by the councils. So there were no other choice for the government to nationalize it. But of course, disastrously after that, when the Iran-Iraq war started and ended, the Islamists, the same regime in power, they so-called privatized those, giving them either free or below market to their own cronies. That's why now we have very few nationalized industry. It's all so-called privatized, but actually owned by either the Islamic Guards or by the mullahs and their sons and daughters.
If I could just ask you one last question on this, because I think it's really important. I mean, we saw protests in Iran, women, life, freedom. There were lots of protests in Iran in September 2022, and then after then. And a lot of people argue that the protests didn't build enough momentum to make a change or overthrow the government because there was no large worker strike or there was no general strike which could actually pose a threat to the government. I mean, that's assuming that they actually want to change the government. I don't want to get into that conversation. That's perhaps for another time. But just on the topic of unions, do you think the government continues to not support unions because it perhaps knows that it would pose such a huge threat to its continued power and to the power of the Revolutionary Guard and the Islamic Republic in general, that if there was this unionization that were to take hold and have some sort of momentum, that it would perhaps pose a large threat to the consolidation of power of the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Absolutely. I mean, the Islamic regime has not only did not allow to have any unions, I mean, even the Islamic councils that they were formed after we were expelled, most of these councils became Islamic councils. Even these yellow state-controlled councils were not allowed in large industries. They said that later we'll do it. It's 44 years now. They haven't done it. We have so many labor activists are in prison. Now, it's good that we are discussing this on the 1st of May today, and many of our activists are in jail now. Many of there have been lots of efforts to create these unions. But in terms of what you mentioned, why the woman life freedom declined, although it's still alive, I argued that street demonstrations alone cannot topple this regime. In order to do that, we need a quadripartite. I've written an article on this, actually, which is also in English. A quadripartite alliance of the street, educational systems, workplaces, and also businesses. If we have linkages between all of these things, then we would be able to topple this regime, which is which is so difficult to do. But of course, there are one of the main reasons that it cannot be done is because of the brutal suppression of any movement that continues. But in order to do that, we need to have these quadripartite alliance.
Dr. Saeed Rahnema, it's been really great speaking to you.
Thank you, Talia. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate that.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. You can find us online at theAnalysis.news. See you next time.